Good morning. Welcome to Freeway Bible Study for today, the 2nd day of May, 2018. Today's a bit of a rainy, blustery day, and so I'm going to go a little fast. Fortunately, it's a small chapter, because I may have to stop and seal the camera up, even though the camera on the top of my head, my GoPro, is waterproof. The port door is open to admit the microphone, so I don't want, of course, it to get wet on the inside. So let's see if I can do this before the rain gets too bad. And I'm going to be going up and over the pass, so it could be rainier. Okay, I'm in good shape. All gassed up. Tires are a little bald, which is a little bit of a concern riding in the rain. So I'll have to make a very careful trip. My name is Kurt Bell. I am your host for Freeway Bible Study. Today we're doing Genesis 40, the Cupbearer and the Baker. And just to begin, a little disclaimer. I am a non-believer. I'm an atheist, so I don't believe the supernatural parts of these stories, but I'm interested in stories nonetheless. So I read them. I read one chapter a day of the Bible, Monday through Friday, and making my way from Genesis through Revelation. So now we're in Genesis 40, just 10 more chapters left in Genesis, and let's see where we stand. In our last chapter, we're following, of course, the tale of Joseph, the same Joseph of the coat of many colors, and he is now down in Egypt land, where his great-great-great-grandfather Abraham wound up, remember? Although things have turned out a bit differently. Joseph's a slave now in the house of Potiphar, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. And in the last chapter we saw that despite God's many blessings upon Joseph, he nevertheless wound up in jail. And that's because the Potiphar, his master's wife, took a fancy to Joseph and kept making overtures towards him. And though Joseph resisted, in the end she had her vengeance, if not her passion, by way of securing Joseph's cloak. Not the coat of many colors, but just the one he was wearing, and laying blame upon him as having come on to her. So that, of course, invoked the wrath of her husband, the captain of the guards, who threw Joseph in the king's jail, which appears to be in Potiphar's house, because we learn in chapter 40 that the king is also mad at his cupbearer and his baker, and has sent them to prison as well, in again the king's prison, which is stated clearly in chapter 40, that's within the house of Potiphar. So now Joseph and the king's cupbearer and his baker are in the same jail. Oh, and I forgot to mention that in Genesis 39, the same charm and good fortune that brought Joseph the favor of his master Potiphar also brought him the same favor of the warden of the prison, such that he was allowed, gave Joseph kind of oversight of the prison, which I can't imagine is more than just a few rooms in Potiphar's house. So now Joseph was in that house, in that prison for a time, it says in Genesis 40, before the cupbearer and the baker arrived. And though we don't know their offenses, why they were sent by Pharaoh to prison, it's been speculated. And by the way, I do some research. I try to research this stuff. So the Bible I have has some really handy research references, which is helpful. And I like to thank my uncle, because he's the one that sent me the Bible, because he sent me a really good Bible that's got those references that I really enjoy. Thank you, Uncle. And I also thank my uncle, because he's the one that started this whole project by sending me the Bible and asking me to read it. So we know from scholarship that the cupbearer and the baker were responsible for the food that came to Pharaoh. And in fact, the cupbearer is actually called the Butler in King's edition, King James edition, where he's called the cupbearer in the New International Edition. And you can imagine a butler standing by, standing by while his master eats, waiting to bring in the next dish, or supervising at least the arrival and removal of plates of food. So it's speculated that perhaps Pharaoh got sick, And since the cupbearer and the baker had direct access to the food, they were suspect and imprisoned, and inquiry occurred. So it's been a time that Joseph's been in prison, and we're wondering, the same scholarship wonders if Joseph was put there by Potiphar, not as punishment, but maybe Potiphar knew what his wife was like and was more angry with his wife and just kind of separated the two. And that might also explain why Joseph had good favor. That also explains why Joseph's still alive, because there was pretty swift and summary justice in those days. There wasn't much need to have long-term incarceration, because sentences usually consisted of freedom or death, or maybe some terrible punishment, like having your hand or your nose or your ear cut off, or your tongue or your eye or your genitals. So anyway, so the cupbearer and the baker have arrived at the prison, and Joseph he's been looking over them for a couple of days, and one morning the cupbearer and the baker, who I guess are sleeping in the same cell, they awaken, but Joseph's not in that cell. They awaken and they both had a dream, and they're both kind of upset because there's no one to interpret the dream. And back in those days, dreams were, and maybe even now, of course, some people do consider dreams very interesting and important portents of the future, right? So there needed to be someone to interpret the dream. In Mesopotamian cultures, there was often people whose job that was. Imagine that to be Madame Zorsky, who would tell all, just come in and let her read your palms, something like that. And there were in fact books of dream interpretation that have survived to this day that you can use to look up the signs that you see in your dream and interpret what they mean. Things, for example, like numbers of objects typically indicate number of days or years, and also things like food, or like a cup being filled, for example, can be indicative of a new beginning, a birth, or some sort of a start. You can kind of see the symbolism of it. So someone with a little bit of training or experience probably can do this pretty well. I imagine people that grew up in the area were quite adept at knowing what the standard interpretations would be. So anyway, they're upset because there's no one to officially interpret their dreams, and they're both in a bad situation. The cupbearer and the baker being in the king's prison under suspicion of possibly poisoning the king, though we don't know exactly what the offense is. That's surmised. So along comes Joseph, and he pokes his head in the cell. Remember, the warden has given Joseph oversight rights to the prison, so he's in charge of these two. Kind of like what would you call it in a modern day prison? An orderly, is that the right word? An orderly or something like that? You have prisoners that kind of have responsibility for doing the work of the prison because they're trusted by the guards. That's what Joseph is. So he pokes his head into the cell where the baker and the cupbearer are, and he can see that their faces are a bit dejected. And he asks, hey, why you guys look so low? It's a lovely day outside. What's up? What's going on? Well, he didn't say that, but you get the idea. And they both say, well, we both had a dream last night, and there's no one to interpret the dream for us. And Joseph says, isn't the interpretation of dreams the role of God? An interesting thing, right? So he's basically, I like that. That's one of those rare little bits of depth I can see in the Bible, and I do mean rare. I mean, I'm through Genesis 40 right now, and I don't see a lot of deep stuff. I mean, you can read a few pages of Marcus Aurelius and find far more depth than in Genesis. Anyway, so depth in terms of alluding to God being the source of interpretation of wisdom and of knowledge, rather than the divination of soothsayers looking at tea leaves and interpreting dreams and looking at your palm of your hands, things like that. So I kind of like that. So, but Joseph, he says, he volunteers himself kind of as an intermediary. Rather presumptuous, I think, but there you go. So he says, isn't that the role of God? And then he jumps in and immediately says, well, how about I'll do that? So I'm sure he means by that he is a vessel by which God can provide the interpretation, a vehicle for the interpretation. Look at that. Wow, Orange County, all cloudy. See all the way out to Newport Beach and the ocean. Anyway, so that the first one, this would be the cupbearer, aka the butler, says his dream. He says, I had a dream last night that before me were 3 vines, And of course he means grapevines. And one of them flowered and quickly became a beautiful bunch of grapes that I then took and squeezed above the king's cup, and then handed the cup to the king so that he might enjoy the juice of the grapes, right? So he's giving wine, he's symbolically, in a moment, giving wine to the king. And so Joseph tells him, let me interpret your dream. He says, remember that any number of items or in a dream can be symbolic of days, years, some sort of a number of some interval of time. And he says, in 3 days' time, and it's important to note the distinction. He says, the king will lift up your head. Okay, up your head, all right? Note that. He will lift up your head and restore you to your position. Basically, he's going to get his job back. The king is going to offer him a innocent verdict and put him back to his role as the butler. He's going to lift up your head and put you back in your position. And Joseph adds, I hope that you'll remember me when you're back in your position, because I'm an innocent man brought to Egypt against my will from the land of Canaan, and I'm an innocent man. So he's imploring him that when he is shown to be innocent, and when the butler is shown to be innocent and back in his job, that he maybe go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh of Joseph's plight, that he's an innocent man. Now then, seeing that the reading of the dream went so well for the butler, the baker then speaks up and said, I too had a dream. In my dream, I had three plates upon my head, and on the uppermost plate were loaves of many types of bread, abundant. And the birds, they did come down, and they did eat of the bread and chew all of the pieces. Speaking of a bird, there's a crow in the highway. Joseph then turns to the baker, and if I were Joseph in this case, I think I would have made something else up. But then your credibility would be shot, right? So anyway, remember he's channeling God, right? So I guess he's got to say whatever God's telling him to say. He says to the baker, let me read your dream. Let me interpret your dream. Again, 3 items. Instead of 3 vines, it's 3 plates. Again, the number 3. To you, in 3 days' time, the king will come. And here's an important distinction. This is literally the distinction that it says in the New International Edition. Remember, in the case of the baker, he said the king will lift up your head. In this case, with the baker, he says the king will come and lift off your head. Off instead of up. It took me a couple of readings before I caught that little bit of not that it's overly complex or profound, but it's interesting. It's good writing, Oh, by the way, this is all supposed to be happening on the king's birthday, on Pharaoh's birthday. Which is interesting. Scholarship says that his birthday wasn't really celebrated at this time, so it may have been the anniversary of his ascension to the throne, perhaps. But anyway, so the butler's going to get his head lifted up, and the baker's going to get his head lifted off. So he's going to be executed. He's going to be beheaded. That's what it doesn't actually say beheading, but the scholarship goes so far as to say he'll be beheaded. And what's more, and then in the King James edition, I think it says that he's going to be hung. And in the New International Edition, it says he's going to be put upon a stake. A very different fate, right? So, but that's after he's been beheaded. His body will either be hung or put upon a stake. And the scholarship says that this was more of an insult than, of course, injury, because he's already dead. So that hanging wasn't a common punishment at the time, and your body would be hung instead, basically as the typical caution and warning to others, and be allowed to sit out there while the birds and animals and insects come and consume it, and it all falls apart. Kind of like putting a man or woman in a gibbet, hanging outside the castle wall until it's just the skeletons fall to pieces. So pretty bad forecasts for the butler. Forgiveness and a return to his job. For the baker, off with his head, and in the further indignation of either having his body hung, his headless body hung, or impaled upon a stake, to be a warning and a for others. And of course, let's not forget the real terror and fear in all of this, especially for all the peoples of the ancient world, wasn't so much the death sentence. I'm sure that for the baker, the fact of that he's going to be killed is bad enough, but what's really bad is to hear that he's not going to get a proper burial, because a proper burial, of course, in so many ancient peoples was key to having a good send-off to the next world, to the afterlife. Everything from the Vikings that would have themselves be burned either ceremoniously in a ship or literally upon their boat with all their goods, and even if it was a king, their slaves and even a girlfriend, and have which the Vikings, they would if it was a really good king, they would put his body on his ship, kill his dog, throw the dog's body on there, take his horses, run his horses to a lather sweat, and then cut the horses into pieces and put the horses on there, take a couple of oxen, kill them and cut them up and put them on there. And then what's more, ask for a volunteer from the slave girls, and then take that girl and rape her by all the men, all the head men of the village in their little huts, and then take that girl into the boat that's going to be burned and lay her down on the bed beside her dead master, and have 6 men come in and gang rape her on the spot before running a cord over her neck and strangling her to death, while a woman called the Angel of Death would stick a shiver with a knife between the ribs. Okay, and then you put the woman's body, his dead slave girl's body, who's been gang raped and tormented for days, even though she volunteered for this, right? But I mean, how much of a volunteer could she possibly have been? She's a slave. And then burned up. I mean, good gosh. Okay, I mean, all that to make sure that the king, in this case the Viking king, could have a nice send-off to the next world, where he would go with his boat, his armor, his sword, his dog, his horses, a couple of oxen, and a gang-raped cutie. And as the men were gang-raping her, they would whisper in her ear, tell your master when you see him in the next world that I did this for love of you, right? Good gosh. Humanity, let's get over this stuff. And Christianity is no different. Christianity is indeed a cult of human sacrifice. I mean, it's all centered around the human sacrifice of Jesus, the spilling of blood for the forgiveness of sins. It is barbaric. It is founded in gross and terrible superstition, and and offers us a forecast of obliteration and eternal damnation for the greater measure of humanity, while a few blessed few, as so typical of these cults, will be the salvation chosen and saved ones who will make it into the next world. And people are operating, a great proportion of my own countrymen are operating and living according to this and voting accordingly, based on these archaic, ridiculous superstitions founded on bronze, iron, and Stone Age traditions and mythology. We got to get over this stuff. That's part of the reason I'm doing this project. So I'm sorry I'm letting some of my true feelings come through. I try so often to do these videos in an objective manner, basically reading the stories and going through them, but the way these, sometimes the ridiculousness of it all, and the sadistic, gosh, I mean, unthinking. I mean, you've got to be unthinking to not be thinking about the big picture. You're just focusing on the prize, focusing on the bits and pieces of the Bible that satisfy you and give you comfort, cherry picking your way through the Bible to the juicy bits that talk of love and forgiving your neighbor and turn the other cheek, while forgetting the injunctions for damnation and consequence if you do not toe the party line. We got to get over this stuff. So anyway, back on the story. So the baker's gonna have a bad time of it in 3 days. And so 3 days pass, and sure enough, the king. It says that the king holds a feast for his not for his servants, but for his staff, right? So he's holding a feast, and I guess this is where they're going to celebrate either the anniversary of his ascension to the throne, or maybe it really is his birthday. Anyway, they're going to they have that feast, and he indeed sends for the baker and the butler, and he lifts the baker's head and hands him his cup and says, "You are forgiven. Pour me a tall glass of Chardonnay." And he turns then to the baker and says, "Off with your head." And he's led away. His head is cut off. He's impaled upon a stake, as is such a disgusting, torturous thing that that did in the old days. Imagine, and it was lucky because he got his head cut off first. Imagine having a stake, while you're alive. This is a very common means of execution in the ancient world. Having a stake, or run up your big wooden pole, run up through your anus, up through and then up into your body, such that it supports your weight, and then propped up in a hole so that you're sitting up there, slowly sliding into the stake, which is moving its way up through your body until if they do a good job, it'll eventually merge through your mouth on the other end, and you're alive through all of this until it finally reaches your internal organs and does some damage, or you bleed to death, right? So, but for the most part, you just die this excruciating death as you slide butt first onto a splintery wooden pole. Gosh, the horror. So that's the fate that awaits the baker, but fortunately after he's been beheaded, and we can only imagine that the beheading must have been a pretty nasty affair too. I don't imagine it's with a chopping block or a guillotine, but with a big knife from the kitchen, maybe, or from the executioner's big knife. And that's the end of the chapter. Oh, there's one last bit where it's pointed out that despite the fact that Joseph offered a favorable interpretation for the butler, and asked the butler when he's restored to his position, to remember him to Pharaoh, the butler forgot. So, and he didn't say anything nice about Joseph. But that's okay. I have a feeling, because I've read it all before, I have a feeling things will work out pretty well for Joseph in Egypt. We'll see. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Have a great day. Make it a good life. Bye-bye.